It's good to see you all and good to be with you. I'm quite excited about a theme like getting deeper or going deeper. And well, we have already had 2 sessions this morning, and you can go deeper indeed in different ways. You can go deeper in trying to understand the big picture, the big story in the Bible. Because very often when you come to the Sunday morning service, you hear an isolated sermon on a particular text and then another text. Sometimes there is a short series. But very often we don't see the whole picture anymore. So that was helpful. And the second session, you can go deeper by looking at a particular theme and trying to see what the Bible has to say about that. But the Bible is full of words. It's a book that is filled with words. And I want to take a story and just go deeper, almost like an example of how you can go deeper. It is a little bit risky because I don't know many of you, but from what I heard and saw this morning and people I talked to, there are people who simply come to church. There are young Christians, people who have been a Christian for a long time. There are pastors. So you will already have reached certain depth in your reading of Scripture and various levels of depth. Nevertheless, I thought I will take a risk, because what I want to do is I want to deliberately take a very familiar story. So not a kind of an obscure text and trying to explain that. I want to take a very familiar story, a story that you all know, and hopefully being able to show there is more going on under the bonnet than we think. And I have chosen, next slide please. I have chosen the story of John 11. I understood one of the pastors, John 11, and I gave it a title, Friendship Tested. Now the surface meaning of John 11 goes a bit like this. And as I said, you know the story. This is a story about Lazarus. Lazarus is very ill. His sisters sent a message to Jesus. Jesus doesn't come immediately. He waits for 2 days, perhaps because he knows what he's going to do. Meanwhile, Lazarus dies. Jesus eventually comes to the funeral and then raises him back to life, and all is good. That is roughly the story as most people understand it. But we will try to go deeper into this text, and especially focusing on why did Jesus delay for 2 days? And why is his friendship being tested here? And besides trying to go deeper into the text, I also want to make some inner biblical connections. That goes along, let's say, the first talk, trying to connect to some other parts in that big story. But let me pray briefly before we go on. Father, as we open your word here in John 11, we pray that you will be able to take this story and help us to reach a bit more depth. Will you speak to us afresh from this story? And Lord, that this may be perhaps a start of a desire, a hunger to go deeper, to go further into your word. Lord, because there is no end, Lord, to what we can discover about you and about your word. And we know that we need your help, and so we ask, Holy Spirit, that you will enlighten our minds and warm our hearts. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So even though you know John 11, I will still read it with you. So there are Bibles in the seat in front of you. So it would be helpful if you either open your app on your phone or take a physical Bible. And it is a long chapter, but I will still read that with you. John 11, here we go. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sister sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and are you going there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble, because they see the light of this world. But those who walk at night stumble, because the light is not in them." After saying this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right." Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought that he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." And Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench, because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I've said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to him, "Unbind him and let him go." Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what he had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the council and said, "What are we to do? This man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and destroy both our holy place and our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all. You do not understand that it is better for you to have one man die for the people than to have the whole nation destroyed." He did not say this on his own, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was about to die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but to gather into one the dispersed children of God. So from that day on, they planned to put him to death. And there I stop. So this is just to familiarize yourself with perhaps some of the details of the story. And the next slide, please. In this session, I want to think of 4 questions. Is Jesus a good friend? And I know that you will want to say yes, and no matter what I will say, you will still want to say yes. But we still raise it as a question, is Jesus a good friend? Secondly, what are people's reactions in this story to Jesus' inaction, to Jesus' delay? And thirdly, how should we understand Jesus' inaction? And then fourth, we return to the first question and think, is Jesus really a good friend? So next slide, please. We start with question number 1. Is Jesus a good friend? So as we have read, John 11 tells the story of a small family in a small village near Jerusalem. And it is towards the end of Jesus' public ministry. Jesus was a close family friend of Lazarus and his 2 sisters, Martha and Mary. And we know this because in verse 5, for example, we read that Jesus loved Lazarus and he loved his sisters, Martha and Mary. In verse 11, Jesus called Lazarus friend. So he was a close family friend. I can almost imagine, the text doesn't say it, but I can almost imagine that when Jesus, because most of his ministry took place in the north, in Galilee, but for quite some time he was also in Jerusalem. Maybe this was a place where he could take rest or where he stayed when he was not in Jerusalem. So he was a close family friend. So in verse 3 we read that Lazarus was seriously ill. And his 2 sisters certainly believed that Jesus could heal their brother. So the logical thing that they did was they sent a messenger to Jesus to inform him about the serious situation of his friend Lazarus. So far, so good. Why would they think that Jesus could do something about them? Well, if he was a close family friend, certainly they had heard the stories, maybe from Jesus himself or maybe from other people. You can think about some of these stories that we find earlier on in the Johannine narrative. Think about John 4, where Jesus healed the son of a royal official just by distance. He did not even go there, he just spoke a word. The royal official's son was healed. John 5, Jesus made a lame man walk. John 6, Jesus could miraculously provide a free lunch for a huge crowd. They didn't even need to pay £10 for it. John 9, Jesus could give sight to a man blind from birth. So surely these sisters had known these stories, maybe even been there, had heard Jesus talk when he probably stayed in their house. So it was only right that the 2 sisters asked their friend Jesus to help them. But the twist in the story comes early. You would expect that Jesus, as a close family friend, would immediately rush to the home of his friend. But no, what does Jesus do? You can almost imagine he shrugs his shoulders and decides to leave only 2 days later. But by then, Lazarus had died and already been buried. Now, in ancient times, but it is largely true of today's cultures as well, friendship was not simply about affection, like having a nice mate. It also was about social roles and responsibilities. A friend was available in a time of crisis. When you are having a hard time, you call upon your friends to support you. You want your friends to be there with you and for you. So Jesus' intentional delay seems to violate the code of friendship. But sometimes we don't dare to think these things, because Jesus always knows what he is doing. And we are talking about Jesus here, the Son of God. But when you look closer at verses 5 and 6, and it depends a little bit on which English translation you have, literally it reads, Jesus loved Martha, her sister, and Lazarus. Therefore, when Jesus heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. Does that not strike you as a little bit odd? We would think Jesus loved his family, therefore he rushed to them when he heard about Lazarus' condition. But instead we have Jesus loved his family, therefore he delayed for 2 days. Can you almost feel that logically that doesn't make sense? But that is what it literally says here. And when you dare to think about it, this is actually very disturbing. The problem sometimes is we know these stories too well, at least at a surface level. We know how it ends. But this is actually potentially disturbing. And this raises several questions. Why did Jesus let his good friend Lazarus die? Why did Jesus dash the hope of the 2 sisters? Is Jesus actually a good friend? Did Jesus handle the situation well, pastorally? Those of you who are pastors, and if a member in your congregation and there is a serious situation, they want you to come, and you say, well, yeah, not now. I may come tomorrow. I may come in 2 days. Can you imagine how people react to that? Is it good enough to say that since Jesus knew that he was going to do a big miracle, that his deliberate delay did not really matter? Or to put it a bit more technical, was pastoral concern sacrificed on the altar of theology here? Do you still want to belt out what a friend we have in Jesus? Before we dig deeper into the text, trying to answer these questions, let's see how some characters in the story react to Jesus. Then the next slide, please. And we start with the disciples. When Jesus speaks of waking up Lazarus who has fallen asleep, the disciples, they misunderstand him, which they regularly do, saying, oh well, if Lazarus had fallen asleep, he will be all right. But Jesus, as we know, had been speaking in figurative language. But for their sake, he now plainly says, Lazarus is dead. But let us go to him. But when the disciples realize that Jesus wants to go back to Judea, they say, do you want to go back there where the Jewish authorities have just tried to kill you? Anyway, when Jesus persists that they should go back to Judea, Thomas, one of the disciples, said to the others, let us also go, that we may die with him. So this is not something that Thomas, what he blurts out, comes out of nowhere. You go back to chapter 8 and chapter 9 and chapter 10. The Jewish authorities consistently seek to kill Jesus, to stone him, because of the claims that he makes, the things that he does. So Thomas realizes how risky it was to go back to Judea. So he says, okay, but still, Let's go with him, that we may also die. So even though the disciples misunderstand the situation around Lazarus, they realized the risk Jesus was taking in going to Lazarus and were willing to die with him. But let's now turn to the two sisters. Most of you know that Martha and Mary had very different personalities. Martha seems to be more the reasoning, the rational one, and Mary more emotional, even though Jesus or the text doesn't make any negative comment either way. And when Jesus comes to Bethany, the village where Lazarus and his sisters live, he meets the sisters separately. He also deals with them differently. We don't have time to go into that, but that is already interesting, where you can go deeper into the text. But despite these differences, the sisters have exactly the same reaction when each of them meet Jesus. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. In verse 21, you find it on the lips of Martha, and in verse 32, on the lips of Mary. So this is obviously crafted in such a way that you hear the sisters, different as they are, reacting in the same way. And there is obviously an implicit reproach. They knew that Jesus was a miracle worker. They knew that he could have healed their brother. That is why they sent the messenger. And here they are saying it in his face. And surely we can understand that the sisters are upset with Jesus. Jesus, a close family friend, only turns up after 4 days. When others, the Jews here, had already arrived earlier to participate in the mourning process. The sisters had faith that Jesus could heal their brother, but they had no clue at this stage that Jesus could even raise people from the dead. But can we blame them for that? So those are some of the people's reactions. Let's go to question 3. The next slide, please. How should we understand Jesus' delay? So we must now try to unravel the issue. Why did Jesus deliberately delay for 2 days? Why did Jesus let his close friend Lazarus die? Why did Jesus not take the sisters' grief more seriously? And I suggest that we have to turn into detectives at this stage in search of some clues. The next slide, please. And I want to do an exercise with you, and I will come to that sheet that you have, where we are trying to find a few clues. There is a location clue we need to find. We know where Lazarus and his family live, in Bethany, near Jerusalem, but where was Jesus? The sisters knew, because they sent a messenger to Jesus. But we still need to figure out where Jesus was. And then there is also a time clue. When did Jesus arrive at Lazarus' tomb? And once you have figured a few things out, we can create a working theory. The next slide, please. And that is what you have on your sheet. So there at the top, finding clues. There is a location clue that we need to resolve. There is a time clue that we need to resolve. And we can ask ourselves, if we know where Jesus was and where Lazarus was, perhaps we can work out how long it would take from Bethany to location X, where Jesus was. Then you can try to work out when the message reached Jesus. You can take into account of Jesus' intentional delay of 2 days. And then also when Jesus arrived at the tomb, and you can try to work backwards. Or you can try to construct some kind of timeline of events. And I want to argue, if you construct that well, that gives you a better insight into the story. So what I would like you to do with that sheet is that you turn to your neighbor. We probably don't have time to put in small groups, but maybe in twos or threes, turn to your neighbor and take that worksheet and try to construct some kind of timeline of events. And I suggest that John left just enough clues in this story for us to work it out. So I give you about 5 minutes to have a crack at it, and then we will compare our findings. Well, for time's sake, I will move on. But I cannot, well, maybe you do have a working theory or the part of it, but let's focus on on those clues, the location and the timing. So where was Jesus when Lazarus died? Where was Jesus? Anyone? He was not in Jerusalem. Bethany, but not the Bethany where Lazarus lived. Near the Jordan River. Where have you got that information from? Previous chapter. So, some of you have figured that one out, because in John 11, you don't know where Jesus is. You only know he comes from somewhere, arrives at Bethany, which is a suburb of Jerusalem, where the Lazarus family lives. So normally in a narrative, you have to go back far enough till you have figured it out. Well, in this case, you don't need to go too far back, because in 10:39, for example, it says, then these are the Jewish authorities, when they tried to arrest Jesus again, he escaped from their hands. He went away across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing earlier, and he remained there. So there's a very specific location. Now, if you can go further back, because you can say, okay, where was John baptizing? Then it depends a bit. You can go back to John 3, where we have an incident where a short narrative where it says that Jesus and his disciples were baptizing, and John and his disciples were baptizing. John was near Aenon, so along the Jordan River, and Jesus was slightly further away. If you go back to John 1, you will read that John was baptizing, again in the Jordan River, but there he was near Bethany. So this is not Bethany, the suburb of Jerusalem. This is Bethany across the Jordan. It says it literally in 128, almost so that you will not be mistaken, Bethany across the Jordan. So wherever it was probably either Aenon or Bethany, but it was east of the Jordan River. So you can give it a very specific name where Jesus was. Now you obviously need to figure out what is the distance between Bethany, Aenon, but somewhere there across the Jordan, to Bethany, the suburb of Jerusalem where the Lazarus family lives. Well, here you need the help of some commentaries, etc., or some background books, which is part of going deeper. And you will figure out that the distance is about 20 miles, which is a day's journey. So now you have translated a location also into a time aspect, because now you know these two places, you know how long it would have taken in that time by foot. It would be a day's journey. Now go back to the time clue. When did Jesus arrive at Lazarus' tomb? Yeah, that's quite clear in verse 17, and then slightly later, Martha was saying he has already been buried for 4 days. So those two clues, I would say, is just enough to construct a working theory. And my working theory is as follows, and that goes on the next slide. You have to do a little bit of reasoning backwards. So let me start reasoning from the end, as it were. When Jesus arrives, so the numbers, day 1, I filled in later. But let's say at a certain day, Jesus arrives at Lazarus' tomb. We now know that it took him about a day in order to reach from Bethany across the Jordan to Bethany where Lazarus lived. We also know that Jesus delayed for 2 days, so you can again make 2 jumps. Then you're on day 2, where the message reached Jesus. And obviously we need to take into account a day when the messenger was sent. Yeah? Can you follow those 4 hoops? So now we go back from the beginning. A messenger was sent, takes a day to reach Jesus. Jesus delays for 2 days. Then Jesus decides to go to Lazarus, and he arrives there, and he heard that Lazarus had already been dead for 4 days. That means, going back to the beginning, when the messenger left Lazarus' home, was Lazarus still alive or was he dead? He was still alive. So when would Lazarus have died? Very soon after the messenger left the Lazarus home. Can you follow that? And now we come to a very important conclusion. When the messenger reached Jesus, Lazarus had already died. The messenger could not have known. Jesus knew. So when Jesus then says, I'm not immediately going, I will wait for 2 days, his delay did not cause Lazarus' death, which we too readily assume. We too easily say, Jesus delayed for 2 days because he knew that Jesus was going, or that he was going to raise Lazarus back to life, etc., and he wanted to throw in all these theological lessons, true as they are, that he is the resurrection and the life. When Jesus said, I'm not immediately going, I delay for 2 days, during those 2 days, Lazarus did not die. So that is an important thing just to remember. Jesus' delay did not cause Lazarus to die. But we must still find an answer to that question, why then did Jesus intentional delay for 2 days? If it was not so that Lazarus could die, so that he could do something big, why then did Jesus delay for 2 days? Again, you really need to dig deep and probably make use of commentaries. And when you read some of the better commentaries, they will point out that in those times there was apparently a superstitious belief that if a person died, that the spirit of a dead person would linger around the grave for 3 days, trying to return to the body, and after 3 days, death was irreversible. A superstitious belief, of course. But nevertheless, you know how many people hang on to superstitious belief. Does it now slowly start to click why Jesus delayed for 2 days and not for 1 day or for 3 days? He delayed for 2 days so that when he arrived, for how many days had Lazarus been dead? 4 days. So that when Jesus raised him to life, no one would have been in doubt that he had raised a really dead person. Someone whose body had already, the whole process of decay had already started. If Jesus had immediately rushed to the Lazarus home, he could have arrived there on day 2. If he had raised Lazarus, maybe some people say, see, the spirit returned. Or maybe he has awakened a comatose Lazarus. Jesus delayed just enough to get him past the 3-day mark, so that there would not be any person appealing to any superstitious belief. Jesus really raised here a dead person. Can you follow that? Does that make sense? But that is slightly different than what the explanations, or maybe the non-explanations, that we sometimes see or hear. Let's go back to the next slide and return to our first question. The next one after the... Yep. Do we now think differently about Jesus? Is he a good friend? As I predicted, you've always believed that Jesus was a good friend, etc. So yes, we can absolutely confirm that Jesus is a good friend. But arguably, in more ways, does this come through in this story than you realize. Even if we can now understand better the reason for Jesus' deliberate delay, and that Jesus' delay did not cause Lazarus to die, it still leaves a few question marks about the quality of his friendship. So let's dig deeper there. And the next slide, please. And to capture that, we must think about the aftermath of the story. We have read that, you can reread it from verse 45 onwards, but what happened there is when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, and as I said, at a moment that no one would, and that is why you don't find any hint that people doubted it, you actually see many of the Jewish authorities, they started to believe in Jesus, but others went to the Pharisees. And they called a meeting, it says here, of the chief priests and the Pharisees, a meeting of the council. This is the so-called Sanhedrin. This was the highest council in Jewish society that ruled on religious judicial matters. And we have read what has happened there. Ironically, they say, if things go on like this, the Romans will come and destroy our place. Ironically, 40 years later, the Romans did come and did destroy their place, their power base, the temple. But at that time, they said, well, it's better than that we sacrifice this man than that we evoke the reactions of the Romans. And from that day onward, they planned to put him to death. So as we know from the early part of the story, somehow the disciples had already an inkling about this. Because when they heard that Jesus was going back to Judea, Thomas said on behalf of the 12, let us also go, that we may die with him. Because they had somehow seen that threat that you read about in John 8, 9 and 10, that this might happen. And here we see it indeed going into practice, put into practice. But we should still go deeper. So it's not simply that Jesus risks his life for his friend Lazarus. A few days later, in the so-called farewell discourses, when he is alone with his disciples, he knew that his time was up. He connects that theme of love and friendship that we find here. We find the term love, we find the term of friendship. He connects those two themes in a new way. In John 15:13, you know that verse most likely by heart, Jesus says to his disciples, no one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Now he spoke to his disciples. Now we know he spoke because he knew what was lying ahead of him, the cross, where he was going to give his life for his friends, the disciples. But surely it was also on Jesus' mind retrospectively what had just happened with the Lazarus story. Because Jesus' return to Judea, Jesus going to the Lazarus home to raise his friend Lazarus, would cost him his own life. The ultimate expression of friendship. Jesus going there, he was literally laying down his life for his friend Lazarus to give him life. The next slide. I go one step deeper and actually suggesting that that kind of friendship in action, as it were, that Jesus set there an example that we should follow. In 1513, as I mentioned, Jesus was speaking to his disciples about laying down his life for him, which he would do ultimately at the cross. Retrospectively, Jesus had already demonstrated that in what he did for his friend Lazarus. But when you move on, and these are these inner biblical connections, if you go to 1 John, so John's first letter, which he wrote later, John actually reasons, and he must have meditated, he must have dwelt on this saying of Jesus and what Jesus put into practice. He realized this is something that we need to pick up. This is something that we need to do. Because in 1 John 3:16 we read, "We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we must lay down our lives for one another." We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another. So John, in his first letter, speaking primarily to his church, but obviously to all other generations of Christians, urges us to imitate Jesus in being willing to lay down our lives for our fellow brothers and sisters. And this can mean a whole range. It can be from sacrificially helping fellow believers to perhaps literally giving our lives for them. If you follow the trajectory in church history in the 2nd century, when the church was persecuted by the Roman Empire, many Christians died a martyr's death. And in fact, a martyr's death in that time was considered the supreme imitation of Jesus. Maybe you're familiar with the story of Bishop Polycarp, who died a martyr's death in the mid-2nd century. But his death was described as follows, and I quote, "He was not merely an illustrious teacher, but also a preeminent martyr, whose martyrdom all desire to imitate, as having been altogether consistent with the gospel of Christ." For us in the comfortable West, it sounds a bit strange or even mentally unhealthy if you aspire to this. But it's remarkable that in this writing it says, this desire to imitate Christ, especially in his death, is consistent with the gospel of Christ. But now when you go back, you follow back, you trace it back. Logically, we can now see it. In the 2nd century, where they considered martyrdom as the supreme imitation of Christ, via John's saying in 1 John 3:16, to Jesus' own saying in 1513. It all amounts to the same. This is a logical extrapolation of what Jesus said and did. So to sum it up briefly, Jesus is our friend. Even if we cannot always understand what or why he is doing certain things, he plays no games with us in dark times. And we see that in the Lazarus story. He did not delay so that Lazarus could die and do something great. And that is not how Jesus plays games with us. And just as Jesus was willing to lay down his life for his friend Lazarus, for his disciples, his friends, so Jesus gave his life at the cross for us, and he calls us friends. But likewise, we should be willing to lay down our lives for our friend Jesus and for fellow believers. Again, whether that be sacrificial service to perhaps a literally giving of your life, because that's what friends do. So rather than Jesus falling short on the standard of friendship in this story, he actually demonstrates the ultimate expression of friendship. That's probably where I want to stop. I don't know, I'll leave it to Manoj if there are any questions. But if you want to go deeper into the text, I think what I find helpful, if you're really into reading, you can go to commentaries. LST, where I work, is next door. People can make use of the library, etc. But there are two maybe recommendations if you want to weave it into your devotional reading and maybe try to go deeper there. I find that, and I can give you the references later, but guidelines from the Bible Reading Fellowship and Encounter with God from Scripture Union, those are, let's say, they go a bit deeper than the Daily Bread versions, etc. They are written by scholars, scholar pastors, etc. They go deeper into the text for devotional reading. So I found that very helpful.